In the late 1970s, there was a pitcher in baseball who looked almost unstoppable. Hitters didn't just struggle against him, they feared him. His name was J.R. Richard, standing nearly 6 feet 8 inches tall with a blazing fastball and one of the most devastating sliders in the game. Richard had become the ace of the Houston Astros. From the mound, he looked overwhelming. His long stride toward the plate made his already high-velocity fastball seem even faster. Batters often described the ball as appearing suddenly out of nowhere, exploding across the strike zone before they could react. But Richard wasn't just throwing hard, he was dominating the league. By the end of the 1970s, he had become one of the most intimidating pitchers in Major League Baseball. In 1979, he led the league in strikeouts with an astonishing 313, overpowering lineups with a combination of speed and movement that few pitchers could match. For the Astros, he represented something the franchise had rarely possessed before, a true superstar. But the story of J.R. Richard's rise to dominance began long before his major league career. Richard grew up in Louisiana, where his size and strength quickly set him apart from other young athletes. Coaches noticed immediately that he had an unusually powerful arm, capable of throwing harder than most pitchers his age. Eventually, he attended Grambling State University, where he continued to develop as a pitcher. Major League scouts soon took notice. In the 1969 MLB draft, the Houston Astros selected Richard with the second overall pick. Even at that early stage, teams believed they might be looking at one of the most physically gifted pitchers in baseball. But talent alone rarely guarantees success. Richard's early years in the major leagues were inconsistent. His fastball was already legendary, but his control sometimes deserted him. Walks piled up. Coaches worked with him constantly to refine his mechanics and develop better command of his pitches. Slowly, the improvements began to show. By the mid-1970s, J.R. Richard was turning into the pitcher scouts had once imagined. His fastball could exceed 95 miles per hour, a rare velocity during that era, and his slider cut sharply across the plate, leaving hitters guessing. Then came the breakthrough. Between 1976 and 1980, Richard established himself as one of the most dominant pitchers in baseball. He was selected to multiple All-Star games and became the unquestioned leader of the Astros' pitching staff. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his rise was the intimidation factor he carried onto the field. When Richard took the mound, opposing teams knew they were in for a long night. Hitters stepped into the batter's box, knowing that a pitch might arrive faster than anything they had ever seen. And when he combined that fastball with his vicious slider, even experienced veterans struggled to make solid contact. By 1980, J.R. Richard was performing at an extraordinary level. In fact, many analysts believed he was on track to win the Cy Young Award that season. Everything about his career suggested that the best years were still ahead. But while Richard continued dominating opposing hitters, something troubling was beginning to happen behind the scenes. He had started experiencing unusual symptoms: fatigue, blurred vision, occasional numbness in his arm. At first, these issues were easy to dismiss. Pitchers often deal with soreness and exhaustion during a long season. Coaches assumed it was simply the result of heavy workloads and the physical demands of professional baseball. But the symptoms continued, and they were about to lead to one of the most tragic turning points in baseball history. As the 1980 season progressed, J.R. Richard's dominance on the mound continued, but the physical problems he had been experiencing refused to go away. Sometimes he complained about headaches. Other times, he mentioned numbness in his fingers or difficulty focusing his vision. Teammates noticed that something didn't seem quite right. Still, Richard kept pitching. At the time, professional sports culture placed enormous pressure on athletes to push through discomfort. Many players believed that showing weakness could cost them their place on the roster. So Richard continued taking the mound, overpowering hitters even as his body began sending warning signs. Then, in July of 1980, everything changed. During a routine workout before a game, Richard suddenly collapsed. He had suffered a stroke. The diagnosis shocked the entire baseball world. J.R. Richard was only 30 years old. At the time of the stroke, he had been leading the National League in strikeouts and was widely considered one of the best pitchers in baseball. Now his career was suddenly in jeopardy. Doctors later discovered that Richard had been suffering from a serious circulatory condition that had gone undiagnosed. The symptoms he had been experiencing, the blurred vision, the numbness, the headaches, had all been warning signs. But by the time the condition was fully recognized, the damage had already been done. The stroke effectively ended his career as a dominant major league pitcher. Richard attempted to return to baseball in the following years, but the effects of the stroke had changed his physical abilities dramatically. The velocity that once made his fastball so terrifying was gone, and the stamina required to compete at the major league level was no longer there. Eventually, his professional career came to an end. The sudden collapse of such a powerful career left many fans wondering what might have been. At his peak, J.R. Richard had been one of the most dominant pitchers of his era. His combination of size, power, and skill was almost unmatched. Some historians believe that if his career had continued normally, Richard might have become one of the greatest pitchers in Houston Astros history, perhaps even a Hall of Fame candidate. Instead, his story became something very different, a reminder of how fragile athletic careers can be. In the years after baseball, Richard faced significant personal challenges. Financial difficulties and health problems made life extremely difficult for a time. But eventually, his story took a more hopeful turn. Through community support and his own determination, Richard rebuilt his life and became involved in charitable work, often speaking to young athletes about perseverance and faith. Today, when baseball historians look back at the career of J.R. Richard, they remember more than just the strikeouts and fastballs. They remember a pitcher whose dominance once seemed unstoppable, and a moment when everything changed. Because sometimes the most powerful careers in sports history aren't defined only by victories. They are defined by the moments when the game and life takes an unexpected turn. And the story of J.R. Richard remains one of the most powerful reminders of just how quickly greatness can disappear.